Imagine a world where people commonly lived for centuries, sometimes nearly 1,000 years, where the first songs were shaped into instruments, where sparks from a hammer on an anvil first rang through a valley, and where cities rose from the soil like the answers to 1,000 restless questions. Picture that world, beautiful and brilliant, full of invention and curiosity, and at the same time a place where God's heart grew heavy with grief. This is the world before the flood, astonishing, creative, and quietly unraveling. What really happened in those years? What strange mixture of wonder and wickedness stretched across the earth before the rains came? The story begins in a garden that was more than a setting. It was a relationship. Eden is painted for us, not as a distant fairy tale, but as an intimate domestic space where God walked with the man and the woman he formed. Imagine early morning light coming through trees heavy with fruit, the scent of fresh soil and fragrant plants, the hush broken by the naming of animals. Adam's task was active and full of meaning, tending, stewarding, giving names that carried authority and care. He and Eve were given freedom within limits. Everything was theirs, save for one tree whose fruit was set apart. That single boundary was not meant to be a test of arbitrary power, but a lesson in trust, a moment to practice relying on the goodness of the gardener rather than asserting autonomy. Something else stood in that garden, two trees that held different destinies for humanity. One symbolized life, a continual, sustaining communion with God. The other, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, represented the painful gift of moral awareness and choice. The presence of both made the human condition possible, invitation and limit, intimacy and responsibility. To choose against God's command was, from the first, to choose a different axis, self over creator, short-term satisfaction over the long arc of flourishing. The entrance of the serpent is marked less by spectacle than by a soft, insidious voice. It asked a question that opened a door. Did God really say? The conversation that followed did not simply overturn a rule. It shifted trust. The act of taking and eating was an attempt to seize wisdom without the humility of dependence. Immediately, their eyes were opened, not to a new clarity that was wholesome, but to the sudden nakedness of shame. They sowed fig leaves as an awkward human attempt at covering what had been lost. Where there had been transparent fellowship, there was now guardedness and blame. The man pointed outward. The woman blamed the serpent. God's first judgments were measured and real, a curse on the tempter, pain and struggle introduced into human relationships, the earth itself made to resist easy harvests. Yet even in pronouncements of judgment, there are strange threads of mercy. God fashions garments for them from skins, the first hint of sacrifice, and drives them out, not in carefree abandonment, but with watchers posted at the edge of the garden to keep the path to the tree of life closed. From Eden's exile, the human story moves forward in the familiar rhythm the text will repeat for generations. Life, labor, offspring, and the refrain that will become almost a beat in the background, and he died. Yet within that cadence of mortality, a new form of cultural life begins. Children are born, people name, move, build. Cain and Abel represent a hinge, a family split that becomes a fork in the road for the whole race. Abel's offering and Cain's offering might seem at first glance a private family dispute about worship style or agricultural practice, but the deeper wound is the posture of the heart. One worshipper's heart is accepted, the other's is not. Anger hardens, jealousy burns. When words fail, violence speaks. Cain murders Abel, and the first blood of this new exiled humanity stains the ground. God's response to Cain is firm and judicial, banishment from the fruitful soil he had tended, a life of wandering. But it also carries protection. A mark is placed on Cain so that he is not killed in vengeance. The exile that follows is both punishment and strange continuance of life. Cain leaves and builds. He settles, erects the first city, and names it after his son. Civilization in this view does not come only from nobility. It rises in the wake of brokenness and human restlessness. What is surprising here, and this is one of the truths often overlooked, is that Cain's descendants become the inventors of what we would call civilizational arts. Within his line, we meet figures associated with the dawn of pastoral life and craft. The one who first lives in movable shelters and tends livestock, the one who fathers the players of instruments and songs, and the one who tempers metal and forges tools. Think about that spectacle for a moment. The very line that begins with murder also gives birth to music, architecture, and metallurgy. Human ingenuity does not belong exclusively to the righteous or the wicked. It blooms wherever human imagination is allowed to work. There is a genius to be admired in those early innovations, the first melodies around a campfire, the first metal edge that changed how a plow turned soil, the first shelter that made communal life possible. And yet, brilliance here is tightly braided with corruption. In Cain's family, we meet Lamech, a man whose pride shows how quickly a culture can harden into violence. Lamech composes a short, almost chilling boast, an early song that serves as a mirror of a man who offers his violent retribution as a badge of honor. Where Cain sought protection, Lamech celebrates escalation, a lineage that defines itself by might and settles scores with extremes. This is not merely an isolated act of brutality. It is a social ethic forming, a cultural code where power is the measure of identity. Paired with the artistic and technological advances from the same line, this creates a paradox. Civilization's outward progress deepens, while inwardly its moral compass erodes. Across from Cain's line stands another family, traced through Seth. In contrast to the city builders and the boastful, Seth's descendants are set apart in the narrative as those who kept calling on the name of the Lord, worshippers who, in the quiet places between births and deaths, sought to preserve a relationship with God. Genealogies in the early chapters of Genesis read like a slow drumbeat, names rolling forward, generations mounting up, and alongside each life, the persistent note, death. Yet in that long parade of years, there is an exception that jolts the rhythm. One man who did not simply live and die, but walked with God so closely that the story says he was taken. Enoch's life is presented plainly yet with an almost electric reverence. He walked with God is a short line that carries a universe of meaning, companionship, faithfulness, an intimacy that rewired the expected pattern. The record of his translation, his being taken so that he did not experience death, stands in stark contrast to the repeated formula of, and he died. It functions narratively like a lighthouse on a dark coast, a sign that God's purposes are not swallowed up by human failure. There are, even in those early chapters, exceptions that point forward to mercy and preservation. New Testament reflection on Enoch treats him as a figure of faith, a person whose life and fate testify to a living trust in God. The biblical text does not invite us to spin tales about the mechanics of his removal. It keeps the focus theological and pastoral. Walking with God has weight, and it can change the expected end. Methuselah's name will always echo in readers' ears because of the unusual span of his years. He becomes emblematic of ancient longevity, and his death, depending on how one reads the chronology, stands near the time of the flood. Some see in the numbers a symbolic alignment, a literary signal that the age is closing. Others urge caution, saying that assigning precise correlations between lifespans and the flood year goes beyond what the text authoritatively gives. The safest posture is humility. Notice the pattern, very long lives, a narrowing promise, a prophetic hope, and avoid the temptation to pin the narrative down to exact modern calendars. Still, Methuselah's long life functions within the story as a kind of bridge, an elder age that reaches toward the coming judgment and the preservation that will follow in Noah's line. Across the generational sweep, recurring images bind the story. The drumbeat of "and he died," the contrast between those who walk with God and those who do not, the simultaneous flourishing of human creativity and the corrosion of moral life. By the time we reach the years that bring the text to the final crisis point, a disquieting collage has formed. Gardens closed, brothers estranged by blood, cities built on displaced soil, music and metallurgy shining in the same light as boasting and bloodshed. Then the narrative introduces a phrase that has troubled and fascinated readers for centuries. The account of the sons of God and the daughters of men, and the mention of the Nephilim, rendered in some translations as mighty men or men of renown. This passage is one of the places where careful humility is required. The text is brief and enigmatic, and scholars and readers have offered different readings. Some understand sons of God as divine or angelic beings interacting with human women. Others read it as a description of godly descendants, perhaps members of Seth's line, intermarrying with the line of Cain. Yet another line of interpretation sees it as a way to describe powerful rulers whose deeds were forceful and notorious. Each reading carries implications for how we understand the relationship between heaven and earth, between spiritual beings and human agency, and how extraordinary the moral breakdown had become. What unites these interpretations is not certainty about the mechanics, but a shared conclusion about effect. The episode escalates corruption. The Nephilim, whether literal giants or simply larger-than-life warriors of mythic reputation, are presented as mighty and of renown. The text uses blunt language afterward. The inclination of humanity's heart had turned. The imagination of every intention had become continually evil. Violence multiplies. The account makes a theological claim about the depth of the moral crisis. People were not merely committing occasional sins. Their habits, their imaginations, their cultural momentum were bent toward evil. Genesis does not indulge in lurid sensational detail. It makes a sober and solemn theological observation. The earth was filled with violence. In that moment, Scripture introduces an image of God that is as painful as it is profound. The narrative uses a word that, when translated into everyday speech, sounds almost human. God regretted. God's heart was grieved. We must be careful here, not to anthropomorphize God as though divine emotion were merely human sentimentality, nor to strip the language of its weight by making it metaphoric in a way that loses ethical force. The point the text makes is serious. The Creator, who made the world to flourish, looked upon what his creatures had done and experienced sorrow. This grief is not a petty mood, but an expression of moral pain that precedes divine justice. It is theologically potent because it shows that God's judgments are not disconnected from relational sorrow. They are enacted by one who feels the loss of what was good. When God resolves to act, the narrative voice invites us to understand the action in two dimensions, judgment and mercy interwoven. The decision to limit the span of human life and to send a flood that would reset the creation society is framed as a response to unstoppable moral decay. Some readers note that a sentence in the text about the Lord saying his Spirit will not contend with humans forever and that their days will be 120 years has been read in more than one way. One reading suggests God is capping human lifespan. Another reads it as a deadline before the flood, a countdown to divine intervention. Once again, humility is prudent. Both are reflections people have made, and the text itself has been a source of interpretive variety for millennia. Into this despair steps a figure named Noah. His introduction is terse but striking. Noah is described as righteous in his generation, a man who found favor with God. He does not emerge as a perfect model so much as a faithful remnant. The narrative lens narrows here. Where the whole broad sweep of humanity has been moving toward corruption, one family line begins to glow with a different light. The contrast is not only moral but vocational. God chooses to preserve not because a people deserve it, but because a remnant exists who will steward a future. Imagine the scene that follows in the mind's eye. A man in a corrupt world hears an odd, divinely given instruction to build something gigantic and strange. An ark, a vessel of preservation. The instruction itself is an invitation to obedience in the face of bewildering circumstances. If the neighbors are singing or forging, Noah is measuring and hammering with a purpose that they cannot see. He begins to construct an ark in a landscape that has not yet been flooded, under a sky still clear. The image is powerful and paradoxical. Building a seaworthy vessel on dry land takes an audacious faith in a future disaster. It signals both judgment and hope. The ark is not merely an escape hatch. It is the instrument of continuation, the means by which God preserves life and his purposes beyond the end of an age. At this point, the narrative gives us a detail that once again invites interpretive caution. An interval of 120 years sits in the account nearby. Some have read this as a period of patient extension given for repentance, a window in which Noah would call the people to turn. Others take it as a statement about shortened human lifespans. The text allows for both readings. It does not compel a single answer. What is clear is that a period of time unfolds, a window in which the ark is prepared and human hearts remain unchanged. The moral weight is unbearable. Offers of mercy go out, hands are raised, but the landscape of sin resists turning. In those years, the world's technological and cultural achievements continue. The music from Tubal-Cain's line still rises, the anvils still ring, cities still spread their shadows. Civilization's outward progress intensifies, even as inwardly it decays. This paradox is one of the most arresting surprises of the pre-flood world. Human ingenuity and moral failure coexist, intertwined like steel and rust. Innovation does not guarantee virtue. Art does not ensure goodness. At times, the fruit of human creative impulse becomes an accelerant to corruption. Tools become instruments of dominion, divorced from justice, songs the soundtrack to arrogance. This tension is not only ancient history, it speaks to our own moment. When technology advances faster than moral maturity, when cultural achievements outpace the wisdom to steward them, the result can be devastating. The story of Cain's descendants inventing music and metallurgy while boasting of vengeance feels uncomfortably familiar. We are invited then to see these chapters as more than strange antiquarian detail. They are a mirror. They ask us, what are we building? Are our inventions ordered toward flourishing or toward pride? Where do we celebrate might over mercy? At the center of this sweeping drama stands the reminder that God's purposes continue despite human failure. The promise that follows the earliest curses, the hint that evil will not have the final word, keeps a thread of hope through the narrative. Even amid judgment language, God does not abandon the created order. He acts to preserve, to restart, to safeguard a remnant who will carry forward the covenantal project. That remnant is not a flawless people. Noah himself is a man of his day, set apart by faithfulness rather than perfection. As the ark frames rise on the dry ground and the neighbors continue their lives, the world hovers on the edge of decision. Some will mock, some will be indifferent. Some may glance at Noah's strange labor and think nothing of the warning buried in his work. Yet the biblical narrator tightens the scene with subtle literary craft, the slow, steady build of a vessel, the echo of generations who have loved and failed, the shadow of Enoch's unusual fate, still recalling that walking with God can change an expected path. The drumbeat that began in Eden, the steps away from God, the inventive human spirit, the corrosion of the heart, now moves toward a kind of crescendo. If this history is meant to counsel us, its message is not merely one of doom. It is rather a sober clarion call about the moral architecture of culture. Creativity without submission can become dangerous. Industry without restraint can harm. Worship misdirected breeds violence. Yet even here, mercy threads the narrative. God grieves, and because he grieves, he acts, both in judgment and in rescue. The ark, then, is a strange emblem. It is the place where God's justice and mercy intersect. Pause for a moment and ask yourself where you recognize echoes of this world in your own. Are there places where skill and invention have outpaced character? Are there communities where loud success masks internal hardening? The pre-flood narrative is not merely antiquarian curiosity. It is a mirror held up to our present ambitions. It warns without despairing. It calls without coercion. It offers a single posture as remedy: walking with God. If you want to follow this thread into the next act, when the rains begin and the ark's purpose becomes clear, subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story. There is more to come: the final judgment, the waters that cover the earth, and the way God preserves a future through one family and a vessel of salvation. For now, return to the scene. The ark's framing takes shape, timbers aligned beneath a sky that still seems indifferent. The city lights in the distance go on each evening. Children are born, and old men die. The smiths still beat metal into useful forms. Musicians still tune their instruments. Yet among this industrious bustle, a quiet work continues under the hands of a man who walks with God. Noah's neighbors look on with curiosity, with ridicule, with disbelief. Enoch's memory whispers that walking with God changes the course of things. Methuselah's long life stretches in the rear view like a warning and a hope. Somewhere in the pattern of dates and names, centuries pile up and a sense of urgency grows. And then there is the final, unavoidable fact. The narrator presses on us. God's grief has led to a resolution. The divine sentence is not cast in the air as an empty thunderclap. It will be enacted. The narrative is moving toward a visible, earthly reckoning. The ark is the visible sign of that turning point. It is the hinge on which the story of humanity will revisit its trajectory. As you imagine these years, the gardens, the cities, the music and metal, the boastful songs and the prayerful remembrances, consider how hope and warning weave together. The ancient story does not leave us in despair. It compels our attention, challenges our priorities, and quietly invites us to examine whether we are building in ways that honor the Creator or in ways that flout him. Soon, the day will come when clouds gather and the hush settles, when the mockers' jeers give way to the sound of falling water. But that comes later. For now, the hammer rings, the singers tune, the families eat and sleep under stars that have watched it all. One man continues to walk with God, and his hands shape something that will change the fate of the world. If this exploration has moved you, share it with someone who loves Bible history and reflections on faith and culture. Subscribe and be ready for the next chapter, when the waters come and the ark's mission will be revealed. The first change in the air is almost imperceptible. A shifting hush, a lowering of light, a kind of collective intake of breath among the fields and the cities. People go on with their lives. Anvils strike metal, flutes are tuned, children run between houses. But there is a different weight now to each movement. Noah, who has been working with steady hands for years, steps back and lets his palm rest on the timber. The vessel he is building is nearly complete. A hulking frame of cedar and pitch, an object that will look to its neighbors like a monument to folly or a declaration of doom. Some will call it madness, others will point and laugh. A few, perhaps, will pause and watch. God's instruction to Noah that he build an ark was exact and practical. It called for measurements, for design, for material choices that made sense for a vessel meant to preserve life through catastrophe. Those specifications are not the point merely because they produce an impressive structure. They matter because they show the way divine commands often look, precise, rooted in ordinary work, and requiring obedience that risks public ridicule. The ark was not a temple, it was a refuge, a workshop of salvation. It demanded skill and patience, carpentry and faith, a willingness to do the hard, mundane labor of obedience when the sky was still blue. For decades, the sounds of that labor were the background to life in the valley. The carpenter's adzes bit wood, the pitch smearers worked the seams, the measuring lines were drawn and redrawn. When rumor spread that a man was preparing a ship on dry land, people came to see. Curiosity, derision, perhaps even a faint suspicion that something was wrong. There is a human tendency to interpret a neighbor's extraordinary obedience through the lens of normalcy. He has built a strange thing, therefore he must be a stranger. The mockery, however, does not dismantle the work. The boat grows in size and purpose, its planks joining, its ribs forming a womb for the future of creation. One of the surprising truths of this period is that the labor of salvation looks like ordinary work. The ark's construction was not accompanied by fanfare or miracles in the visible sense. It was built plank by plank, day by day. This pattern should not surprise us. In Scripture, God's instruments of preservation are often ordinary means. A staff in a prophet's hand, a simple cup given to feed the poor, a family that perseveres in faith. Noah's obedience does not erase the need for skill and craft. Rather, it sanctifies them. The very arts that corrupted can, in another setting, steward life. Tubal-Cain's forges and the musician's strings had been enlisted in pride and violence. Here, the carpenter's trade becomes a vehicle for mercy. What of the people outside the ark? Genesis paints their response in broad strokes. They continue in their patterns. Those who hear Noah's message and shrug may be sincere in their unbelief, or simply hardened by repetition of sin. Others who mock may do so out of fear that the world is changing. It is easy to imagine the daily scenes, markets noisy with haggling, festival laughter echoing under the moon, and in the same breath, a man at the edge of the town, Noah, nailing planks under a sky oblivious to the coming devastation. The narrative invites us to imagine the moral complexity of society, bustling achievement and everyday living, even as the moral foundations erode invisibly beneath a public calm. The mysterious phrase about 120 years hangs in the air like an ambiguous sign. Some readers have rightly taken it as a curtailing of human lifespans, a divine limit placed on the ages of people who once lived for centuries. Others read it as a window of patience, a period during which Noah could call his generation to repentance, a preaching season stretched into years. Both readings have traction and both preserve an important truth. God provides opportunity for turning. Whether the 120 years are a limit on longevity or a period of warning, the underlying pattern is clear. God moved with both firmness and forbearance. He announced a remedy that combined boundary setting and extended chance. When the appointed time arrives, the action of judgment is neither capricious nor hasty. Genesis emphasizes that the earth had filled with violence and that every intention of the human heart tended toward continual evil. The language is solemn and cumulative, not a single act, but a habitual, pervasive turning away from the Creator. God's grief is emphasized as a motive for action. This is one of the most theologically unsettling and profoundly human images in the story. The Creator, who made beauty, seeing that beauty twisted, feeling sorrow so deep it issues in a decisive response. The picture challenges simplistic theologies that imagine divine wrath as merely punitive. Here, judgment is rooted in sorrow, a response by one who loves what he made and who will not let corruption stand unchallenged. Then the rains begin, not as a sudden torrential downpour designed for cinematic shock, but as an escalation of waters, an overturning of the created order. The fountains of the deep are said to burst forth, whether read literally as subterranean springs or poetically as an image of the earth's waters reasserting their primacy. The result is the same. The world as it had been known is undone. The rains fall, the floodwaters rise. Where once there was song and the ring of hammer on anvil, there is only the cadence of the storm and the deeper movement of waters that cover everything. The ark, by design, becomes a sealed space, a portable world in miniature. Inside, life is cramped and sacred. It is simultaneously ordinary and holy. Noah and his family, his wife, his sons and their wives, enter with the beasts in pairs, each according to their kind. The animal presence in the ark is not a romantic tableau, but a complex, practical reality. The smells, the care, the need to feed and tend, the regularity of duty that keeps the vessel alive. Imagine waking to the lowing of cattle, the rustle of fur, the call of birds. Imagine the family's hands moving through these tasks with a rhythm of prayerful care. The ark is a micro-economy of stewardship, a concentrated expression of the call to care for creation, even amid judgment. It is worth pausing on the logistics without succumbing to trivia. The narrative does not intend for us to linger on the exact mechanics of how animals walked onto the ark or how sanitary conditions were maintained. Instead, it points our attention to what the ark represents: the continuity of God's purposes, the preservation of life, and the response of faith amid catastrophe. The vessel's size and design underline one reality: the act of salvation is neither accidental nor trivial. It is deliberate, foreseen, and executed with wisdom. Outside the vessel, the world changes in ways that are final and irreversible. Where once fields grew and cities hummed, waters now enforce a new geography. The text says, the waters covered the mountains, submerging what had been the fixed points of human pride and security. The flood levels the things humans trusted most: their cities, their achievements, their neighborhoods, where they felt invulnerable. The theological force of the flood is not primarily a lesson in meteorology. It is a moral reordering. It shows that the cosmos itself responds to the breach between creator and creature. Nature becomes the stage on which moral consequence plays out. Notably, the flood's destruction is not a spectacle of divine caprice. The story emphasizes continuity with earlier judgments: exile from Eden, Cain's wanderings, God's spoken decrees. These are not isolated episodes, but a movement toward restoration through decisive correction. The flood resets human history, allowing a new beginning for those who are preserved. There is also a strong current of mercy. The saving of human and animal life is proof that God will preserve creation, not annihilate it. Judgment and mercy meet in that watery narrowness. When the rains stop and the waters begin to recede, the world changes again. Shorelines rearrange, memories of the old order are preserved in scattered ruins, and the tales of survivors. The ark rests on the mountains of Ararat. That resting is not the end, but the hinge to a new beginning. The gradual drying, the sending out of birds, a raven that flies and a dove that returns, are small movements that signal the world's reawakening. The dove returns at first, and then comes back with a fresh olive leaf in its beak, a sign of greening beginning again, a token of life's persistence. The image is not theatrical flourish. It is the very simple and powerful language of restoration. Leaves, light, the slow thawing of an emptied sea. Noah's first act upon exiting is emblematic. He builds an altar and offers sacrifices. This is not a pagan ritual, but an expression of gratitude, acknowledgement, and reorientation. From the ruins of a world cleansed by water emerges a worshipful act that connects humanity back to the Creator. God's response is covenantal, a promise not to curse the ground again in the same way, and a pledge never again to destroy all flesh with a flood. The sign given to mark this promise is a bow in the sky, the rainbow, an enduring visual reminder that divine patience and presence will continue even amid human frailty. The covenant ties the physical world to moral responsibility. God protects and promises. People must steward and respond. The rainbow itself is one of the story's profound surprises. In a narrative that began with 2 trees in a garden, an ark on dry land, and a deep grief in the heart of God, the rainbow functions as both comfort and covenant. It is a symbol that the Creator binds himself to creation with promises that transcend human failure. It also calls the human community to new behavior. The safety of a covenant requires a response of faithfulness. The world after the flood is renewed, but not perfected. The covenant is not a license to sin. It is a framework in which renewed obedience can flourish. Here again, the tension between human creativity and moral responsibility re-emerges. The post-flood generations resume their building and cultivating, planting vineyards, forming settlements, organizing lives. Human ingenuity persists, yet the flood has taught a painful lesson. Culture and technology must be bound to moral restraint. The story warns against the blind worship of ingenuity as its own telos. The arts and crafts that once contributed to corruption can be reclaimed as tools of stewardship if reoriented toward a renewed fear of God and care for neighbor. This is not simply a historical note, it is a perennial moral challenge. The arc from Eden through Noah's survival teaches a repeated pattern. God plants, humans cultivate, humans fail. God grieves, God judges, and God preserves. The repeated refrain should not be read as despairing determinism. Rather, it is a redemptive pattern. Every time the human project stumbles, the narrative marks a God who is unwilling to abandon the creation that he loves. The preservation of a remnant signals that the end is never the final word. There is always a chance for a new beginning, for a people who will walk with God and steward the earth rightly. One of the surprising truths that threads through is the variety of human response. In the same family trees, there is both genius and brutality. Enoch's walk with God is not a one-off miracle to be fetishized, but a theological marker. Intimacy with God changes destiny. Methuselah's longevity functions as a witness that time itself connects epochs. Whether his lifespan precisely overlaps the flood year is a matter of careful interpretation, but his long life symbolically stretches an older age into the threshold of renewal. Lamech's boastful song warns of cultural decline when retribution becomes a virtue. These pieces combined show that the pre-flood world was not morally monolithic. It was complex, capable of producing both profound good and staggering evil. In the end, the flood narrative confronts us with moral questions rather than offering simple answers. What are the habits that corrode a society over time? How does innovation become divorced from virtue? Where do we see echoes of Cain's city building and Tubal-Cain's forges in our own industries and art forms? The story does not condemn creativity. It calls us to tether creativity to humility and justice. It asks whether we will allow the crafts we love to become instruments of pride and domination, or whether we will shape them into channels of mercy and care. For the contemporary listener, the story's pastoral application is subtle and urgent. The pre-flood world teaches that a flourishing culture demands not only technical skill, but moral formation. Our legal systems, our technologies, our arts, our cities, these are neutral in themselves. They are good or destructive depending upon the orientation of the hearts that shape them. The ark becomes an image of what faithful living looks like in a corrupt age, a life committed to preserving life, to tending creation, and to walking with God, even when the horizon of cultural approval points away. We are also reminded that divine action is always accompanied by a summons. Noah's life was a summons to obedience in the face of opposition. Enoch's life was a summons to intimacy that defied the common cadence of mortality. The text invites us to consider that faithfulness is often countercultural and costly, but it is also the means by which God chooses to preserve and renew. Walking with God rarely guarantees social popularity. It often guarantees a life held in the center of God's purposes. Finally, the covenant after the flood gives us theological stability. God will not abandon his creation to endless destruction. The bow in the cloud speaks to an enduring divine commitment to the world. Yet that commitment does not remove human responsibility. The covenant is a new beginning that requires human response. Worship, justice, care for the land, and the humility to submit human creativity to God's design. As the waters recede and the fields slowly recover, the human story moves forward again. Marriages are formed, children are born, songs return to the valleys. But the memory of the flood lodges in the communal mind as both warning and gift. It is the kind of memory that shapes law, liturgy, and ethics. It will inform future covenants and the ways communities teach children about the bounds of human action under the heavens. Look now at your own culture with the light of this ancient narrative. Where are we shaping instruments that could either heal or harm? Where are the songs we celebrate teaching humility or hubris? Are we calling one another to walk in ways that honor the Creator, or are we merely applauding technical accomplishment? The story pushes us toward a single practical posture: to walk with God. Walking with God is not a mystical, private hobby reserved for a few. It is an orientation that reshapes our work, our art, and our societies. It means that when we forge metal or compose music or govern cities, we do so with a conscience shaped by the Creator's purposes. It means repairing wrongs, caring for the weak, and refusing to let success become our God. It means listening to the divine grief and letting that grief alter our behavior, so that when the neighbor's life looks different, we do not shout triumph, but extend help. If this account of the world before the flood has surprised you, if the strange mixture of creative brilliance and moral failure unsettles you, then let it also move you to a humble next step. Reflect on the places where skill has outrun character in your own life. Consider the communities you help build and whether they honor life. And find in Noah and Enoch a model, not for private perfection, but for persistent faithfulness. People who, amid a turbulent culture, chose obedience and intimacy with God. The ancient story does not end with sadness alone. It closes with a covenantal promise and the image of a bow arcing over the clouds. That rainbow is not merely an aesthetic afterthought. It is a pledge that even in a world capable of great harm, God remains committed to preservation. The invitation is clear: walk with God so that your building contributes to flourishing rather than destruction. If this exploration has stirred your heart, share it with someone interested in Bible history and spiritual reflection. Subscribe for more careful, thoughtful looks at these ancient stories and their surprising truths. May the witness of those early generations, of Enoch's walk, Methuselah's long life, Lamech's harsh song, and Noah's faithful labor, prompt in us a renewed commitment to build in ways that honor the Creator. May we be a people who, when faced with a world drifting toward harm, choose obedience, tenderness, and steadfast care. Go then, with the reminder that God grieves what is lost and acts to restore what can be renewed. Listen for the call to walk with Him, and let your hands be instruments of preservation.